I'm Tanner Olson, and this is the Walk a Little Slower podcast. Here we talk about hope and heaviness, creating and continuing, joy and sorrow, life and God, questions and answers, and everything in between. This is a podcast where you are invited to slow down, to lean in, to hold fast, and to eventually keep going. Welcome. Welcome back to another episode of the Walk a Little Slower podcast. Thank you so much for being here. On today's episode, I'm talking with poet and pastor and author Drew Jackson. He is the author of God Speaks Through Wombs, Poems on God's Unexpected Coming, and his latest collection titled Touch the Earth, Poems on the Way. We talk a lot about Touch the Earth on this episode. Drew, he reads some of his own poetry from the book, and I gotta tell you, they are fantastic. It's a really good. I think I say like 5 times during the conversation, like, dude, this is a really good book, and it is a really good book. And if you're looking for a new collection of poetry to read through, to be challenged by, to be filled with hope by, you can check out the show notes. I have links to both of his books, but Touch the Earth is the one that we're going to be talking about a lot on this episode. A little bit about Drew. He lives in New York City with his wife and daughters, and as we talked about before I clicked record, I'm sorry you missed out on this, but Drew is a big Philadelphia 76ers fan. So we talked a little NBA before I pressed record. So I'm so sorry that you had to miss that. I know many of you are just so upset about that. Anyways, that's the introduction for the podcast. Thank you for being here. Make sure to subscribe and rate and review the show if you want. This is a no pressure place. Anyways, with that, here is episode 51 of the Walk a Little Slower podcast.
Yeah, it's such a good question. It's been changing, because it used to just be squarely, I'm a pastor. And so that was very easy. It was very straightforward. I think with the emergence of poetry and writing in my life, it took, and I don't know how this was for you, but it took a little while for me to say, I'm a poet. I'm a writer, and to just claim that as part of my identity, part of my vocation. But I've gotten more comfortable saying that. I don't know if that is, has come with like having poetry books out in the world. But I think also it's become this thing where like now more people actually know me as like writer, poet than pastor. So yeah, I think that has become, just something I've just owned that way. So I've grown comfortable in saying that, but I think even more broadly speaking, if we like get into conversation, then, I just love to talk about how like I have like my heart is to really, help people connect to the divine, right? And connect to this bigger, more transcendent purpose of engaging in the work of love and justice in the world,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And you certainly do that in your books. Let me ask you this question. Have you ever found yourself in a conversation with somebody and they ask what you do and your answers are, all right, I'm a pastor, I'm a church worker, and I'm a poet, and you just don't know which one to give because you don't want to put yourself into that conversation? Because I've been there where I've been like, it was actually in Philadelphia. I was in line to get a cheesesteak. I don't know where, but it was one of the places that the internet told us to go to. And this guy was like, hey man, what do you do? And at the time I worked at a church, but I'm also, a poet. And I was like, man, am I going to get into this right now? So I went with poet. Not that I'm ashamed of my faith, not that I'm ashamed of Jesus. Yeah. I was in line to get a cheesesteak and I was hangry. And I was like, well, I'm a poet. And the guy didn't like acknowledge that. He basically was just like, well, you know what you should write. You should write political poetry. And I was like, this conversation's over. But it was always weird when I worked at a church and as a poet as to like what do I tell somebody, because those conversations go in very different directions.
Yeah.
But to kind of speak for both of us here, if I may, we're still doing the same thing with
Mhm.
poetry. It's still like inviting people to see that they are known and loved and cared for. And that's
Absolutely.
really the work, as as a church worker, as a pastor, as a worship leader, whatever it is that you can do. It's to invite people to know that they are loved and seen and forgiven. So for you, how did the whole poetry thing begin? It's always
Mhm.
like it's different for everybody, but I think like I remember when I heard stories of people of how they got into something new, it kind of gave me the courage to try something different. I know that we have listeners who are like, I maybe one day I'll be a writer, or I'll be a
Mhm.
painter, I'll be this, but like how did you begin?
Yeah, so I really like my love for words. I would say
Hmm.
it really started when I was young, but it started through being introduced to hip hop, right?
Mm.
So I'm the
Yeah.
youngest of four boys, and my older brothers just they used to listen to hip hop all the time. And so like my oldest brother's 10 years older than me. I can remember riding in the backseat of his car. He's older, he's cool, you know what I mean? All of those
Yeah.
sorts of things. And I'm just hearing, and I always say there's two types of hip hop listeners. There's those who are first drawn to the beat, and then there
Hmm.
are those who are drawn to the lyrics. And I was always drawn to lyrics and words and how they're fitting together to make different sounds and to say different things with only a few words. And what I didn't realize was that I loved poetry is what it
Yeah.
was.
Hmm.
Um, but I didn't really start writing poetry in the form I'm writing now until much more recently. I started writing hip hop lyrics when I was in college. That was
Hmm.
sort of my first experimentation with kind of putting words together. When I got into my 20s, I stopped doing that, and all my writing ended up being sermon writing.
Yeah.
Um, it was all sermons. But someone pointed out to me that even in my sermons there was so much poetry that was coming through, and just how the words were being crafted that I'm like, I guess this is just in me. So it wasn't really until the pandemic that I started writing poetry
Hmm.
in the way that I'm writing now. And I really needed something, I think, to um, kind of ground me, like a spiritual practice to ground me, that was something that was spacious enough to hold the questions that I had in that moment,
Yeah.
um, and poetry. I'll be curious to hear how you would talk about this, but I always find poetry to be something that's not so much concerned with providing a bunch of answers as it is in inviting us more deeply into questions,
Hmm.
to wrestle with them, to sit with them, to linger with them. And so that's what poetry became for me. It was a spacious place for me to sit with all of the questions, to bring them before God.
Yeah.
Um, and both questions of obviously the stuff that was going on in the world with the pandemic and with racial injustice and racial violence, and but also all of how that was impacting my own soul, my internal emotional landscape, what it meant for me to be a husband and a father in a tiny New York City apartment, couldn't go outside, had twin 5-year-old girls at the time, like all of these sorts of things. It's like I need some sort of practice to be able to engage all of that. And poetry was that, both reading a lot of poetry and writing a lot of poetry.
It's a great way, and I don't want to say it's not a great place to escape, but it's a great place to lean in. Like poetry is a great place for
Mhm.
us just to like kind of drop everything, lean in. And the thing that I love about poetry is it really doesn't ask anything of you.
Yeah.
It's not like math where it's like we're going to
Mhm.
get to an answer. It's not
Mhm.
like science where there's this, these things that people have learned and equations and all this kind of, school stuff, which I'm not really
Mhm.
into. But like what poetry does is it kind of just like pulls the chair out a little bit and says, you can think right here.
Yeah.
And for us as poets, and as me as a human, like I don't have a lot of answers. I know like three or four things that I am very, very certain about.
Yeah.
Like I know that Jesus loves me. I know that
Yeah.
Jesus died and rose again. And I
Mhm.
know that hope is real. And I know that the
Mhm.
Orlando Magic are going to win a championship. Maybe
Someday.
while I'm alive. Those are the like, or there's not a lot. And so poetry is just like invites you to wrestle, but it also
Mhm.
invites you to rest. And even in that, just like asking questions,
Yeah.
that in itself almost feels like an answer, right? Like
Yeah,
I don't necessarily need the answer. I just need to ask my questions and to have a place to do that.
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and one thing I've been thinking about lately in terms of, what poetry does is that if it asks anything of us, I think poetry is asking us to pay attention
Mhm.
and whatever that means, however that shows up. But there's an invitation always that poetry gives toward attention.
Mhm.
And I know I love what the poet Mary Oliver says when she says, I don't know what a prayer is. I know how to pay attention. Right. And there's
Mm.
this just that act of slowing down, paying attention to what's going on in my internal landscape, what's going on in the space between myself and another person, what might
Mhm.
be going on in um I don't know, the smallest little thing that in any other any other case we might just pass over quickly, but poetry
Yeah.
says slow down and see the little thing. And
Mhm.
that's what I love about it.
And as a pastor, like when you read through the Gospels, like Jesus, maybe he wasn't a poet, but he
Yeah,
definitely lived like he was one in his interactions and his
yeah.
conversations. And kind of going back to what you said, like your sermons. I'm sure you get the comment and the feedback, like, man, was that whole thing a poem? Was that just like one long poem? Like,
Yeah.
especially after when I'll do like poetry events or poetry shows, like I'll be like, all right, here's a poem, and then that finishes, and I'll talk between it, and some people are
Mhm.
like, was that also a poem? And I was like, no, that was a transition. This is the
Yeah.
transition, right? But like when I read through the Gospels, like it's almost as if Jesus, the way that we're talking about poetry, kind of is personified in the way that Jesus reacts and responds to other people,
Yeah.
creating a space, inviting people to ask questions. And
Mhm.
one of the things I love about your books is that it's paired with scripture. Like you walk your first two
Mhm.
books,
Yeah.
right? So your first one, God Speaks Through Rooms, and then your latest one, Touch the Earth, it walks through the book of Luke, right? So this
Mhm.
Touch the Earth is what, Luke 9 through Luke 24. And
24. Yeah.
you just kind of like, you just write
Yeah.
through it. And there's like there's social commentary that's written through
Mhm.
it. There's like reflections of the gospel and of the truth.
Yeah.
And there's also like, my favorite part, there's a lot of favorite parts of the book because it's like scripture, a quote of some sort, and then a poem. And
Mhm.
I love all the quotes. The quotes are like, I'm like, they put Tupac in this book. This is amazing. He's got Lupe Fiasco and
Yeah.
was there's like Richard Rohr in there and Rosa Parks.
Yeah.
Like I'm reading this. I'm like, oh, I could spend a lot of time with this book, which is what poetry books invite you to do is like, hey, like
Yeah.
you're going to spend a lot of time with this book, by the way, if you're wondering. So what was the writing process like with
Yeah.
Touch the Earth, but also, it's your second book, so
Mhm.
I'm sure a lot has changed. And like you said, and I'm just rambling now, but you started writing during the pandemic,
Mhm.
which was a very heavy time and a heavy time to start writing poetry. So do you
Mhm.
think that 2020, 2021 really kind of shaped you as a writer and how you approach the paper?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways it did. Um, especially in these first two projects, right? Which for me, it's one project.
Mhm.
It's two
Yeah.
books, but it's really one project.
Right.
And yeah, there was just like I said, there was a lot of things that I'm processing at once at the same time, and like just trying to figure out how to navigate through all of it. And so writing each of those poems was for me, um you know I wanted to bring my full self into conversation with the text. And I don't know, as someone who's been, I've grown up in a lot of spaces, particularly in like white evangelical spaces, that have often
Mhm.
told me that, when I come to the text to do, interpretive work, that I have to sort of check at the door my identity, right, as part of who I am, my
Mhm.
blackness, and all of those things. And you know, when I was writing this, I was like, I just want to bring my full self into conversation with the text, with the people in the text. Um, because um, I need to be able to have real conversation, you know? And
Hmm.
so, uh, that's sort of kind of how these poems began to emerge for me, was just to bring my full self, including my imagination, and
Hmm.
just say, I want to see how this is going to unfold on the page. And So I would usually come to a particular portion in the text, and maybe I wasn't trying to write like a commentary on
Right.
the like,
Yeah.
but it was more so I would come to a verse or a collection of verses and just say, okay, what is rising to the surface? What's happening
Mm.
in me? How do I pay attention to that? And so maybe it was one word that stopped me, or maybe it was a particular phrase or whatever it was, and then I would just let the poem sort of emerge however it wanted to emerge out of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I said, it's a wonderful book. I want to read one of the early pages from this book. It's called the title of the poem is called Leftovers, and
Mm.
it's a reflection of Luke 19. And if I was doing my homework before this, I would have had that pulled up and would have been able to read it. But I'm going to do that right now. It's from Luke 9:17 is what it's about, and that verse is, um, and they all ate and were satisfied, and what was left over was picked up, 12 baskets of broken pieces. And the poem, oh, it's so good, called Leftovers. You mind if I read it? Can I butcher it for
Yeah,
you?
go ahead.
Is
Go
that
ahead.
fine? All right.
It'll be
It
my
goes,
first time hearing somebody else read this one. So yeah.
oh, it's always weird and they always do it wrong. So I'm happy to be wrong. It goes like this. Never show up to the cookout or slide to the fish fry without some Tupperware in hand. You won't want to miss the blessing of these leftovers for days on end. The best hosts always provide take home containers. Take as much as you want, child. There's plenty to go around. It's just so good.
Thank you.
When I read that, I had and I'm a very emotional human being, but I had even those that last line, like take as much as you want, child, there's plenty to go around, just like chills up and down my body. So and you and I, obviously very different people, very
Yeah.
different backgrounds, very different teams that we follow in the NBA. But this, like, for you writing this, like, I can put myself in this poem. I can hear my grandma say those words, and I know
Mm,
that you can hear your grandma, or
yes.
your aunt, someone say
Yeah.
those words to you. Like, what was your thought process as you were writing this one?
Yeah. So this is the feeding of the 5,000. And
Mm-hmm.
um yeah, just the when I was reading that verse, and it was just talking about how there's plenty left over. There was more than enough. And I was just taken to every cookout, every party, and how one staple of so many of those cookouts, and particularly within Black culture, is just this like insistence on you are going to take home some food with you,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're going to take There's going to be enough for you to take home, uh, and you don't have to worry about the food running out, right? There's abundance here. There's more than enough here, and just how that is such a part of just like the economy of the kingdom of God,
Mm-hmm.
just this
Yeah.
idea of like more than enough, and
Mm-hmm.
how we have been, sold this narrative of scarcity, that
Mm-hmm.
there's not enough to go around, right? And how that forms us. But what you see reflected in this story is there's more than enough, and that like what would it look like for us to sort of orient ourselves to the world in that way, and but also how the kingdom of God shows up in a cookout.
Yeah.
How do we pay attention to that? Yeah,
Yeah. And that goes back to what we were saying too, is like, as poets and as writers, it starts with paying attention.
yeah,
It doesn't start with writing. Like writing comes after paying attention, and you're
yeah,
watching and you're seeing like, I mean, that's just like you captured it beautifully. And then you took something beautiful, from the text and you said, hey, I'm going to show what it looks like now as well too. And I don't know, I just think he did a fantastic job with, well, that piece and with the entire book in general. But talk more about about Touch the Earth. Why this book? Why now? And who is it for?
Yeah. So, yeah, this book really comes. The title of it comes from the title poem. So I wrote that poem first, "Touch the Earth," which opens the collection, and just whole idea of it is that in Luke chapter 9, there's a natural turn in the text where Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem. He's, you know, very clearly on a mission, but it becomes more about also like the journey of discipleship and the way, following Jesus on the way. So you hear a lot about like, the disciples being engaged in this work and this journey with Jesus. So in Luke chapter 9 is the first time that Jesus sends out his disciples to put into practice everything that they've been learning. And so I just began to really process, like, what does it look like and feel like and sound like when the things that I've been taught about faith and love and life and grief and joy and all of those things, what is it like when those things actually put on flesh and begin to get into the dirt of the world and actually touch the earth. And so yeah, that's really what this collection is. And so there's I would say a little bit of a difference between the first book and the second book is that the second book has much more of myself in the poems. Like I show up more in them because I feel like I'm trying to discern what it looks like for me to be on the way on this journey. And so yeah, it's really what this book is. And so I mean, I'd love to read the first poem for you, just even kind of get a sense of what what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, I want to hear it.
Yeah, so this first poem is called "Touch the Earth," and I wrote it in reflection on Luke 9:1-2, and yeah, I'll read it and then we can talk about it a little bit. Touch the earth. My father says more with his hands than he does with his lips. I cannot recall him sitting me down to teach me about love, but I watched him tend to my mother as cancer spread through her insides. He cried when her breath left her, though he never lectured me about grief. I am still grieving my mother, still gleaning what my father taught me. Gather it from memory. Let it touch the earth.
This sounds like that's one of those poems where you have taken all of you and put it into not as few words as possible, but into the right amount of words for the reader.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this poem it's about my dad, which the book is dedicated to my dad. And I say in the dedication, he's the who taught me that faith is more than talk. And he didn't, like, he's still not a person that has a ton of words, right? But the way that he demonstrated and lived out faith in front of me, like I don't think it wasn't until I started to get older that I began to recognize how deeply he was teaching me along the way. It was, my mom was the one who I would sit with and have long conversations with and all that. And my mom taught me plenty, right? The first book is dedicated to her.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I started to reflect on my dad's impact on me, and in particular, watching him love my mom,
Mm.
and specifically the way he loved her through her sickness, um, and tended to her as she was, on her deathbed, right? And just watching him love her, watching him grieve, um, and realizing how much he was teaching me about those things without saying a whole bunch of words about them. And
Yeah.
so that was for me also just, it's like part of so much a part of what discipleship is, and how Jesus discipled, those who were following him, where it's like, yes, Jesus sat and taught them, but so much of what they learned from Jesus was observing Jesus,
Mhm.
watching Jesus. Um, and so that's where that came from.
Yeah, it's a do as I do kind of thing. Like I
Yeah.
am, and I sounds like we had a very my father feels very similar to your father, my mother very
Mm.
similar to your mother, and
Yeah.
there were times where when I was younger, I would always want my like dad, tell me more, say more, and I never vocalized that, and I'm sure he would have, but now looking back, he was showing me. He was
Hmm.
showing me, and he was showing up, and he was showing me, and
Yeah.
he was showing up, and he was showing me. And my mom and I, like we like, so we just sit and we would talk, and we would talk, and we would talk,
Yeah.
and it's a beautiful thing. That is a very beautiful, it's a very powerful poem too. Also, you have a great reading voice for poetry. That's
Thanks.
good. It's very different than mine. Mine is like, well, here you go, and yours is like, no, you're gonna listen to this. I'm like, you're right, I will. I will. No, I really enjoy that. I'm gonna bounce back, and I'm gonna share another one of your poems. But actually, I'm going to have you read it because after hearing you read it, you should be the one who reads it. Fish Fry.
Oh,
It's the second to last
yeah.
poem in the book. Um, and it's perfect. Uh, Also, I love a good fish fry. So,
Yeah.
uh,
Yes.
would you read that one too?
I will. Yeah. So this one is called Fish Fry, and I wrote it in reflection on Luke 24:39 through 43, which is it's post resurrection, and it's when Jesus shows up on the shore and has a breakfast of fish
Yes.
fried over the fire with his disciples. And this poem has an epigraph, a quote from a writer named Nafisa Allen, in an article that she wrote called "Fried Fish is a Fixture in Black American Cuisine." And it says, fried fish had always been a fixture in our gatherings. This unsung hero of family meals took on new purpose in keeping our bonds strong. Fish fry. Ain't nothing more down to earth, touching the dirt, than a fish fry. Only the real ones know. I'm talking about aunts with battered hands covered with buttermilk, flour, and cornmeal. Touch those hands and feel the evidence of love. There will be no doubt of how real the love is once that fish touches your lips. Throw on some hot sauce and you'll insist that this is a divine visitation.
Big question for you.
Mm-hmm.
What's your hot sauce of choice?
I grew up on Louisiana Red.
All right.
And so you know, I enjoy that. But I'm always willing to switch it up. Lately, honestly, I've been a sriracha guy.
Ooh. I don't think there's not a wrong
It's
answer.
not a wrong answer.
There's wrong answers to different people, but there's no
Yes.
wrong answer here. I'm a Frank's guy, so I don't know
Well,
what that says about
Frank's is
me.
good.
Um, I read this one last night as I was getting ready for bed, and I read it like 3 or 4 times, which is how you know it's a good poem.
Mm,
Um, Either that or it's like a really terrible poem and I couldn't figure out, but this is like this is a really good one.
yeah.
And you can read it from about, I don't know, 100 different perspectives and it continues to hit again and again.
Mm,
Like if I read try to read this from where you're sitting, it's beautiful. And if I read this from like the perspective of one of the disciples. It's beautiful, that line of touch those hands and feel the evidence of
Yeah.
love.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I would say this, you have a lot to be proud of about this book.
Thank you.
This is really good. Never show up to the cookout or slide to the fish fry without some Tupperware in hand. It's just all good. I feel like after reading this, and I think you do a great job of this, like you feel like I can sit down, like I know you now. And I don't, but like
Mm,
I know you now too. And that's like the hope with my books as well. It's like I want people to come up to me afterwards and be like, we're friends. Like I know you. And you do,
yeah.
because what you've done with this book is you've taken a part of you, a piece of you, and you've handed it over and said, like, hey, like I understand like life is heavy, life is hard, life is difficult, but here are some beautiful things. And we can
Mm,
wrestle through the heaviness together and we can create
mhm,
bonds and build bridges together. Because you do talk a lot, um, not you talk about it deeply and overtly, but never super directly, really about like social justice and the
mhm.
divide between people.
Yeah.
But you get to it in such a beautiful way that is hopeful, honest, and inviting.
Mm,
Um, do you want to say any more about? Because I know that's a big part of the book.
yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's such a part of when we talk about, you know, the things that Jesus is teaching us. What does it mean for them to come real in in the stuff of the world, right?
Uh-huh.
It means we have to also like I want to talk about the joy, right? I want to talk about the cookout and the thing, but I
Yeah.
also want to talk about, you know, the hard stuff, the stuff
Hmm.
that does move us toward griefs and moves us toward rage,
Hmm.
both personally and collectively, right? So I just want to be like I'm being very honest about like what have been some of the things that I have had to navigate through as a person, as a Black man who's been navigating American life, right? This is my own personal stories, the stories of my family and my people, like they show up in
Hmm.
this book. And
Yeah.
so, and in particular, just like how I've navigated those particular things, like racism as it's manifested itself in church spaces as well, right?
Hmm.
That's another part of conversations that I'm having in this book. And so, um, yeah, I think it's important. There's a poet by the name of June Jordan. One of the things that she says is she says poetry is a political act, right? That there is something in poetry and when I talk about politics, I'm not talking about our partisan political system. I mean, the way that we live together socially, like the way that we interact, the way that those things are structured. That poetry is, in a sense, it talks about those things, it gets at those things. It maybe not always very directly or overtly,
Hmm.
but like in an Emily Dickinson sort of tell all the truth but tell it slant sort of way,
Yeah.
right? And so, yeah, I think it's just an attempt to be honest, with the fullness of who I am and bringing them to these poems.
Yeah. And I'm really glad that when you started writing this book, you decided and made the wise choice. I'm gonna say wise choice of bringing your full self and not checking anything at the door, not checking your background, your race, your ideas, your thoughts, your beliefs. Because that's when the best books are written, and that's when you can stand up and say, I wrote this.
Mm,
Let's talk about it. And I'm sharing everything openly and honestly. I mean,
mhm.
I've said it 4 times on this podcast already, but you did a phenomenal job with the book. Before we get out of here, I want to play a game. And I did this last time I had on my friend Sean Dietrich, Sean of the South, on the podcast. And he's another writer from the South, and he would eat it up about all the fish fry and stuff like that. But do you mention Waffle House in the book at all? Just a question.
I don't think so. I don't think
All
I
right.
do.
Next book. That's my challenge. All right. This game I want to play to close out the podcast. It's called Finish the Sentence. And I'm going to
Yeah.
start a sentence and you just finish it. And we'll see
Okay.
where it goes. The first one is the perfect breakfast is.
Ooh, egg, and cheese on a roll. It's New
What do you
York
get to
City.
what do you get to drink? What do you get to drink?
Just an orange juice. Oh no, coffee. I need a coffee.
Yeah. Are you just black coffee or are you cream sugar?
I'm a cream sugar person. I can
Like
do
at home?
black, but I prefer cream sugar.
I love it. I love it. All right. Next one. Here's what I know about heaven.
Mm, that it is full, overflowing with the presence and love and beauty of God.
I'll take that. That is beautiful. All right. When I wake up tomorrow,
I'll get my girls ready for school.
so, someone's got to do it. All right,
Someone's got to do it.
last one. I don't know much, but I know for certain that
That God is love.
yeah, this was fun. Thanks for thanks for hanging out with me for a little while.
Yeah.
Do you have one last poem you want to share?
Yeah, yeah. I'll end this with this one. This is a poem on the resurrection.
Mm,
It's called Under the Ground. And there's a quote before this poem by Dr. Barbara Holmes, and she says, "In the beginning, there is darkness. It is the womb out of which we are born. In this state of trusting refuge, the light of divine revelation, which pierces but does not castigate the darkness, may finally be seen. This is a mothering darkness that nurses its offspring." Under the ground. Life is always happening underground. The place light has forsaken. Finite minds cannot take in that the belly of Mother Earth is indeed a womb. Entombed in the soil is the pip of a new Eden. Only the seed that has fallen into the pit can burst through into the morning dew to announce to weeping eyes that a new day has risen. A day in which the voices and stories of women are believed, their word received as good news. And the men have no problem following them and learning how to believe again. What I mean is this. The world has been flipped on its head. Heaven has invaded hell. The spell of death is broken and the doorway opened to a new way of being. It all begins with seeing that the darkness of our world is luminous. And in the humus of life is where we become fully human.
oh, it's good. When you do poetry events, do you do poetry events?
Yeah, yeah.
Do you have people snap or clap?
People do. Yeah.
People do.
I don't, they do.
Anytime
Yeah.
I do an event, people will, after the first poem, they don't really know when it's over, so I'll make the motion to clap, and then they'll start clapping, and then someone would always be like, "Aren't we supposed to snap?" And I'm like, you can, but like, no, like, you don't like go to a basketball game and someone dunks and you snap, you
It's,
clap. So like, you can just
yeah,
clap for
yeah.
you clap. I would clap for you, but no one likes clapping on a podcast. It's a very good poem. It's very good.
Thank you.
I really enjoy it. I'm really glad that we had a chance to kind of talk about this book and to meet. Last thing, where can people find your work? Where can they get the book?
Yeah, so you can get the book anywhere books are sold, anywhere you get your books. Find me on Instagram is where I spend most of my time. D Jackson Poetics. So yeah, would love to see you, connect with you, and yeah, thanks for having me on, Tanner.
Hey, anytime. Really appreciate you, Drew. And I look forward to reading the rest of this book and then hopefully doing an event together one day.
Yeah, would love it.
But anyways, man, appreciate your time and I'll talk to you soon.
All right, man.
Well, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Walk a Little Slower podcast. Make sure you check out the show notes before you go. Go and grab Drew's latest book, Touch the Earth, and follow him on social media. Again, he's full of hope and wisdom. So check out his work there. Huge thanks to my friend Matt Daring for creating the music for this podcast. Go ahead and visit writtentospeak.com to check out latest blogs. I've been writing a bunch over there. You can grab some books, and you can book me for upcoming events. If you want to see where I'll be in the country, just check out the tab events on writtentospeak.com. I'm like the title of my first book, I'm all over the place. Or if you just want to send me a message, you can do that from writtentospeak.com as well. And if you would like to support this podcast in the mission of my work, you can visit patreon.com/writtentospeak to become a patron. Your monthly donations allow me to continue to spread hope and announce love and have conversations like this one that I had with Drew today. So you can check that out at patreon.com/writtentospeak. All right, I have said enough. That'll do it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening, for tuning in. I really appreciate y'all. We'll be back next Monday with another episode of the Walk a Little Slower podcast. Much love.